The last poem of Lamentations, chapter 5, literarily deviates from the preceding four poems in several ways. One of the literary features of the fifth poem in chapter 5 is that it's not an acrostic, as are the preceding four poems. In other words, the lines or the stanzas in chapter 5 do not consecutively begin with a sequence of the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. But nevertheless, the attempt is made to kind of imitate the acrostic form in chapter 5, in that it consists of 22 poetic lines, which is equal to the number of the Hebrew alphabet letters. But a second literary feature of chapter 5 is that it is much shorter than the preceding four poems. Each stanza in chapter 5 consists of only one poetic line, and thus it contains a total of 22 poetic lines. And this contrasts with the three-line stanzas, the 66 poetic lines in chapters 1 through 3, and two-line stanzas, or 44 poetic lines in chapter 4. So in length, chapter 5 is only a third as long as chapters 1 through 3, and it's only half as long as chapter 4. A third characteristic is that chapter 5 has a different rhythmic or metrical pattern to the poetry than in the preceding four poems. Now, in chapters 1 through 4, the dominant rhythmic or metrical pattern is that the poetic lines consist of a longer statement followed by a shorter statement, and thus a 3+2 rhythmic pattern. And that 3+2 rhythmic pattern seems to be closely associated with the mourning or the grieving content of chapters 1 through 4. But in chapter 5, the rhythm is that the two parts of each poetic line are of equal length, and thus a 3+3 pattern. So chapter 5 does reflect a movement away from the Lamentations rhythmic poetic pattern that is found in the first four poems. A fourth literary distinction is that in chapters 1 through 4, the predominant speakers are that of individuals, and they speak more as an observer or reporter who kind of stands outside of the situation describing it. And even the personified daughter Zion in chapters 1 and 2, she too speaks as an individual in the first person singular. And the first time we hear the collective voice of we or us is not until in chapter 3, and then reoccurs again in chapter 4. But in both of those chapters, the collective voice only very briefly intrudes into the individuals speaking. But in chapter 5, the only voice that speaks is the collective voice of Jerusalem. And in chapter 5, it is the collective participants who pray to God in the midst of the trauma. So there is this general movement from the individual voices in chapters 1 through 4 to the plural collective voice in chapter 5. Another key shift that occurs is that there is a movement in the literary type or the literary kind of poem. In chapters 1 and 2 and also in 4, the literary genre is predominantly that of lamentation. That is, it's a mourning song or a funeral dirge. And as such, it focuses more on describing the situation, talking about what has happened, and focusing on the reversals that have occurred. And so specifically contrasting the past glory with the current calamities. The Lamentations are not a prayer, and thus they are not specifically addressed to God. But in chapter 5, as in chapter 3, the literary genre is that of a lament prayer spoken directly to Yahweh. Now, even though both chapter 3 and 5 are laments, the lament of chapter 5 is slightly different in that it is a very specific kind of lament, that of a penitential prayer, and thus it includes the confession of sin as well as petitions for restoration. Now, this general movement from lamentation or mourning to lament prayer, I think it reflects an increase in the community's ability to direct their words toward God in prayer. That rather than merely mourning over the loss of the figurative death of Jerusalem, chapter 5 appeals more directly to Yahweh. Now, these 5 literary shifts, again, first a movement away from the acrostic form in the first 4 poems to the pseudo-alphabetic poem in chapter 5. Secondly, a movement away from the 3+2 rhythmic pattern in chapters 1 through 4 to a 3+3 rhythmic pattern in chapter 5. Thirdly, a decrease in the number of poetic lines. It goes from 60 to 44 to 22. Fourth, the movement from predominantly individual speakers to the plural community speaker. And then 5, this general movement from lamentation or mourning song to communal lament, penitential prayer. That these 5 key literary shifts really do create the sense of the lessening of the characteristics of the lamentation or mourning or grief, in the sense that the feeling that the intensity of the grieving process has to some degree been left behind. So literarily, there is the impression that one is moving out of the traumatic stress, the feeling that the poems have helped in processing the traumatic feelings and emotions and the grief. And thus, the impression that one is making progress on the road to coping with the stress. The literary characteristics kind of leave the feeling that in the process of going through the tunnel of trauma, in which one is enveloped by total darkness, that as we come to the end of chapter 5, one is moving closer and closer to the light at the end of the tunnel. So because of all of these literary movements, one would almost expect that at the very end of the Book of Lamentations, there would be some definitive affirmation that one has come to the end of the tunnel and emerged out into the light. One would expect that as the book finishes, that one has arrived at the end of the traumatic experience. But as chapter 5 ends, it seems to end on a more somber note, even a minor note. Now the petitions as chapter 5 begins in verse 1, remember Yahweh, what has come upon us, and look and see our reproach. And the petition in verse 22, restore us, Yahweh, to yourself, and thus we will be restored. Renew our days as of old. Those petitions are future oriented. There is the desire or the request that restoration and renewal will occur. And yet, you then move to the very last verse of the chapter, verse 22. Even though you have utterly rejected us, and you have been very angry against us. Much more minor note that the book does not come to a decisive, definitive conclusion that expresses hope. And even though in chapter 5 there is this request for renewal and restoration, there is no concluding promise or assurance of restoration or healing or renewing at the very end of the chapter. Rather, in verse 22, there's kind of this sense of open-endedness. Now, if you contrast the end of the book of Lamentations with, for example, the end of the book of Job, where after all of Job's lamenting and expressions of sorrow and agony, after all of his petitions for God's intervention and healing, there comes at the end of the book the theophany from God in which Yahweh speaks directly to Job. But at the end of Lamentations, there is no direct speech from God in response to these petitions. We could also contrast Lamentations 5 with the lament psalms in the book of Psalms. The lament psalms in the book of Psalms often end on a note of anticipatory praise to God, saying that the prayers will praise and thank God because they have confidence that God will intervene on the prayer's behalf and bring about restoration. For example, one can note the ending of the communal lament of Psalm 79. And Psalm 79 is a communal lament expressed in a situation very similar, if not identical, to that of the book of Lamentations. God, the nations have come into your inheritance. They have afflicted your holy temple. They have made Jerusalem into heaps. They have given the corpses of your servants for food to the birds of the skies, the flesh of your godly ones to the wild beasts of the earth. They have poured out their blood like water round about Jerusalem, and there is no one to bury them. We have become a taunt to our neighbors, a scorn and a derision to those around us. How long, Yahweh, will you be angry forever? Will your jealousy burn like fire forever? Do not remember against us the iniquities of our ancestors. May your compassions quickly come to meet us, for we have been brought very low. Help us, God of our salvation, for the sake of the glory of your name, and deliver us and atone our sins for your name's sake. Let the groaning of the prisoner come before you, according to the greatness of your arm or your power. Preserve the sons of death, in other words, the ones who will die. And it ends on verse 13, and then we, your people and the flock of your pasture, we will give thanks to you continually, to generation after generation. We will recount your praise. That the psalm ends on this note of anticipation of praising God once again in the future. And that is really the kind of thing which we hope that Lamentations would end on. That the book of Lamentations would end on a high note of future praise or a declaration that God has heard. But it doesn't. It's interesting that in the Jewish liturgy on the 9th month of Av, Lamentations is read to commemorate the destruction of both Solomon's temple in 586 BC, as well as the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD. Now, in that liturgical Jewish reading, rather than ending on the uncertain note of verse 22, verse 21 is reiterated again after verse 22. So the focus shifts to the future restoration that God might bring. And it's assumed that the reason for repeating verse 22 at the end is it then brings the reading of Lamentations, it ends on a slightly more positive note rather than ending it with verse 22. So the key question regarding verse 22 is, on what kind of minor key does Lamentations end? What is verse 22 saying about the future beyond the trauma? Now, with respect to verse 22, if one looks at a variety of translations, one finds that the verse is translated in a variety of different ways. And the translations range on a continuum from extremely positive affirmations to the other end of a high level of negativity, with kind of a range of expressions of uncertainty in between. Now, where on that continuum the interpretation of verse 22 lies, whether between negative or extremely positive or somewhere in the middle of that of uncertainty, where the translation lies is completely based on how one translates the first two Hebrew words, ki'im. Some translate those two words as a strong affirmation that God has utterly rejected. Restore us, but rather you have utterly rejected us. You are still very angry against us. And thus, verse 22 contrasts with the request in verse 21, actually to the point of negating the request. Strongly implies that God will not respond with restoration and renewal because he has and he continues to utterly reject them. So translated in that way, the book ends on the note that the people should not expect any restoration at that point because God is still very angry with them. In contrast to that translation, some translations suggest an extremely positive affirmation that God has not utterly rejected. Restore us, renew our days. Surely you have not utterly rejected us. You are not still very angry with us. In other words, since God has not rejected, or some even translate it, cannot reject, then assuredly God will restore and renew. The issue with that translation is that the grammar really does not support that reading, as the two Hebrew words, ki'im, do not imply a negative or a not, so that grammatically there is no negation to support the reading that you have not utterly rejected or you are not still very angry. So we kind of reject that on grammatical grounds. So others translate this more in the middle of the continuum. And thus the translations leave the future more open-ended. Understanding verse 22 is expressing an uncertainty about what God will do, an uncertainty about how God will react to their requests, and again, thus leaving the future open-ended. And one of the ways that this is done is that translations leave it indefinite as to how God will respond. So that verse 22 is translated so that it merely describes the past and the current situation and thus says nothing with respect to the future. Nothing is stated nor implied as to how God will respond in the future. For example, in the Message, bring us back to God. As it is, you've cruelly disowned us. You've been so very angry with us, referring kind of God to God's past and current actions. Or the New American Bible Revised, for now you have indeed rejected us and utterly turned your wrath against us. Again, leaving unexpressed what God might do in the future. Many translations actually read this as a question, which results in the book ending with an unanswered question. Restore us, Lord. Or have you utterly rejected us? Are you still angry with us? In other words, the question implies that the community does not know whether God will or will not restore. The future becomes completely dependent on how God might respond, and how God might respond is not known, but it's questionable as to what he will do. Again, from a grammatical perspective, the two Hebrew words, ki'im, do not usually introduce a question. A third way of translating this, reflecting this sense of uncertainty and open-endedness, is that many translations understand it as expressing a condition. Yahweh, please restore, unless that is not what you want to do. Restore, renew, unless you have utterly rejected us and are very angry with us. In other words, how God responds to the petition to restore is seen as being conditional on what God's continuing attitude will be. And from the people's perspective, the divine attitude is seen as being uncertain, or the people simply don't know what his attitude is. And thus it leaves the divine response to the petition, again, very open-ended. A fourth way of translating this, on the continuum between complete uncertainty and extreme positive affirmation, is that of cautioned optimism. But verse 22 fully acknowledges that the current situation is the result of God in his anger punishing his people. But the expectation is that God will not continue that past and current rejection. But the expectation is that God will rather, in spite of the people's past sinfulness, that God will respond favorably to the people's confession of sin and to their turning back to God. In other words, restore us, renew our days, even though you have utterly rejected us and you have been very angry against us. Now, this is how I understand and translate this, largely based on the broader covenant theological context out of which this lament prayer arises. The expectation for God's gracious dealing with his people in the future is based on the dynamic of the covenant relationship, in which the people, when the people have sinned and God has punished, if the people then humble themselves, confess their sins, and turn back to God, then God will act in restoration and renewal toward them. Now, this is expressed in the covenant blessings and curses of Leviticus chapter 25. After the punishment has come, and I will make your cities a waste, I will desolate your sanctuaries, and you I will scatter among the nations, and I will draw out after you the sword, and your land will be a desolation, and your cities will be a waste. And you will perish among the nations, and the ones who are left among you will rot away in their iniquity in the lands of your enemies, and also in the iniquities of your fathers they will rot away. And if they will confess their iniquity and the iniquity of their fathers, and if then their uncircumcised heart is humbled, then I will remember my covenant with Jacob and also my covenant with Isaac. And also my covenant with Abraham I will remember, and the land I will remember. And surely also this, when they are in the land of their enemies, I will not reject them, and I will not abhor them, so as to bring a complete end to them, to break my covenant with them. But I will remember for their sakes the covenant of their ancestors, who I brought out from the land of Egypt in the sight of the nations, so as to be their God. Now, the situation that Leviticus 26 is speaking about is precisely the situational context of the book of Lamentations after the judgment against Jerusalem has occurred. And in Lamentations 5, the people are doing precisely what Leviticus 26 advocates the people to do when in that situation. They are humbling themselves. They are acknowledging their sins. They are committing their future into God's hands, asking God to remember and to restore, as he said he would do in the covenant arrangement. And that covenant relationship, again, forms the whole theological basis for confessional prayer, as expressed in Solomon's dedicatory prayer for the temple in 1 Kings chapter 8. Speaking to God, he says, when your people Israel are smitten before an enemy because they have sinned against you, if they turn to you and they confess your name and they pray and they seek mercy from you in this house, then you will hear from the heavens and you will forgive the sin of your people Israel, and you will return them to the land that you gave to their fathers. When they sin against you, and you are angry with them, and you give them to an enemy, and they take them away captive to the land of the enemy. If they take it to heart in the land where they have been taken captive, and they turn and seek mercy from me in the land of their captivity, saying, we have sinned, and we have committed iniquity, we have done wickedly. And if they turn to you with all their heart and with all their soul in the land of their enemies who took them captive, and they pray to you toward their land that you gave to their fathers, and toward the city that you chose and the house that I built for your name, then you will hear from the heavens, the place of your dwelling. You will hear their prayer and their seeking mercy, and you will maintain their just cause. And you will forgive your people who sinned against you, and will forgive all their transgressions that they have transgressed against you. The covenant itself and the theological perspective of the effectiveness of prayer within that covenant relationship presupposes that God will respond to the penitential prayer voiced in Lamentations chapter 5. And thus in Lamentations 5:21 to 22, to read verse 22 as a complete negative that God will not respond because he is utterly rejected, that goes against the conditions of the covenant relationship and the statement in Leviticus 26:44 that God would not utterly reject so as to bring a complete end to the covenant. But also to read verse 22 as an unquestionable affirmation in the sense of, because we have confessed and petitioned for a restoration, such means that God must respond as we have asked him to. That can imply that the covenant relationship is a mechanical, inflexible, impersonal cause and effect. If we do this, then God must do that. And when viewed in that way, prayer ends up being a manipulation in which Yahweh must do what we as humans ask him to do. But the covenant is the dynamic relationship between God, the king, and his people, his subjects. And the people affirm there in verse 19 of chapter 5, you, Yahweh, sit enthroned continually. Your throne is from generation to generation. The community recognizes that God is their ruler. He is the king whom they serve. He is not merely there at their beckoning to do their will. So even though the people are turning back to God, what the future holds is still God's decision. What happens is God's prerogative, not the result of human manipulation. And thus I suggest that the middle ground of a caution optimism is the best way to understand verse 22 and the end of the book of Lamentations. The verses 21 and 22 are not a skeptical questioning of God's character. It's not a questioning of his desire or his ability to create a new future for his people. Nor are they dictating to God what he must do. Rather, the end of the book indicates on the people's part a humble trust in God, yet fully leaving the future in God's hands. And thus the poem does end on an unresolved minor note of cautioned optimism. It does leave the situation somewhat open-ended, but I think it rightfully does so, because how the end of the story is written is not up to the people. Rather, the rest of the story is up to God to author. In the midst of trauma, and specifically the relevant example of the current coronavirus pandemic, I think many people can relate to the ambiguity or the lack of definitive future as expressed at the end of Lamentations 5. Now, in many parts of the world, we seem to be on the recovery side of the coronavirus pandemic, in that we are in the midst of reopening schools, reopening businesses, reopening society, lifting restrictions on travel. But even so, for many, there is still the emotional stress regarding the future and what the new normal will look like. We continue to function in a world where we still wait for a vaccine against COVID-19. And even though we're doing all of the right things to help assure our and our family's future health, such as we practice physical distancing, we wash our hands, wear face masks, and take all the necessary health precautions, even so, we cannot assure our personal future that we will not contract the virus. And even more so, there is a lot of uncertainty about what the corporate future of the post-pandemic world will look like. All that we know is that things will not go back completely to what it was like before. And that unknownness about the future even adds to the stress of the traumatic event itself. But I think the end of Lamentations 5 is instructive in that it demonstrates that we, God's people, can place the future into God's hands, even though what will happen is unknown to us. At the end of Lamentations 5 suggests that we can face our earthly future with a cautioned optimism when we are in a covenant relationship with God. But besides the theological open-endedness and leaving the future restoration in God's hands, the ambiguity at the end of the book also, I think, informs about processing trauma and grief. As the book of Lamentations ends on an unresolved note, it does leave one with the feeling that the whole process of working through the grief and the trauma has not ended. It hasn't ended, even though we have come to the end of the book. That even though there is really the lessening of the characteristics of lamentation and mourning in this last chapter, as we talked about, there still is no final definitive closure. It is as if the final chapter, the final lament, has not yet been written. There's thus the impression that in working through the emotions and the psychological impact of the trauma, there may be more laments and lamentations yet to come. And that even though we've worked through the 4 acrostics and the 1 pseudo-acrostic, in other words, even though we've worked through the expression of grief from A to Z 5 different times, one gets the feeling that the cycle may not yet be completed. You get the impression that everything needed to be said in expressing the grief has not yet been said, and that the working through the trauma will still continue. So this unresolved ending of the book gives the feeling that one may have to work through these feelings yet again, and later do so even yet again, and even later work through these feelings yet again. Well, the nature of the psychological impact of trauma is such that one does not just work through it once, and then you're done with it and one can fully move on. The reality is that the effects of trauma have to be worked through again and again and again, with each time being a step on the journey of coping better with it. And we also realize that some griefs and traumas are so horrific that there may not be an ultimate resolution of their effects this side of eternity. That sometimes the repercussions of trauma are a never-ending story that we continue to live with and continue to work through it again and again and again. And I would suggest that the generation that went through the destruction of Jerusalem had to continue to work through that again and again. And those who, the next generation who continued to live in exile, had to work through similar feelings again and again. As the book of Lamentations ends on this kind of unresolved minor note, it reflects the sentiment that the process of trauma and grief is an ongoing process. But again, as one does it within the context of the covenant relationship with Christ, one can do so with a cautioned optimism of healing and renewal, even within our time here on earth. So in light of this unresolved ending to the book of Lamentations, some questions for thought. 1, have you had a close family member, relative, or close friend pass away? How long did it take you to work through the grief? And even when the emotions and feelings of loss have faded into the background, such does not completely alleviate the sense of loss. So relate some experiences that have triggered memories of that person in which you once again very deeply felt the emotions of loss, which had to be processed once again. 2nd, a common proverb is, time heals all wounds. Is that proverb applicable for all situations? Does time heal all wounds? Or can you relate a time when a wound from a traumatic event, it did heal over, but with a scab, and then something happened that ripped that scab off and reopened the wound with all of the emotional and psychological feelings that came with it? 3rd, how might we cultivate a sense of genuine trust and confidence in God knowing that the future of restoration and renewal that we envision and even ask Him for may not be the future that He will give to us. In other words, what should our part of the covenant relationship look like when the immediate future remains open-ended and uncertain with respect to restoration and renewal?